You carried the bag in from the car last weekend. 20 pounds of mixed seed for a price that felt like a small win. You filled the feeder by the kitchen window, brushed off your hands, and waited for the rush. And it came. A chickadee, a couple of house finches, a cardinal at dusk. But if you stood there long enough, coffee going cold in your hand, you might have noticed something a little strange. The birds aren't really eating. They're sorting. Beak down, flick, flick, and half of what you poured is on the ground, before the feeder even stops swaying. By the next morning, there's a pale ring of grain under the pole that nobody has touched. You probably told yourself birds are just messy. They're not. What's happening at your feeder is closer to a careful shopper, reading the ingredient list and quietly setting the box back on the shelf. And once you understand what they're rejecting and why, you may never reach for that cheap bag the same way again. Welcome. This is a channel for people who feed the birds in their own backyard and want to do it a little better each season, without the marketing and without the old myths. If that sounds like you, a subscribe just means that next time we sit down to work out what's really going on out there past the glass, you'll be in the room for it. No pressure. Just good company and honest answers about the small lives at your feet. Stay with me, because near the end I'm going to show you why a bird the size of a ping-pong ball needs far better fuel than any bag of cheap grain can give it, and what a single freezing night actually costs a chickadee just to make it to sunrise. Once you can really picture that, the seed aisle starts to look like a completely different place. Let's start with what's in that bargain bag, because the word filler is doing a lot of quiet work. Turn the bag over and read the ingredient list the way you'd read one on a cereal box. Near the top, you'll often find milo, also called sorghum, those little round reddish-brown beads, along with red millet, wheat, and cracked corn. These grains are cheap to grow and cheap to buy by the ton, and that's the entire reason they're in there. They add weight in bulk, so the bag looks generous for the price. The catch is that most of the birds you're hoping to see, chickadees, cardinals, titmice, newthatches, the finches, mostly ignore them. It's not that these grains are poison. Doves will happily clean up milo from the ground. Some sparrows out west will take it. And white proso millet is genuinely useful for juncos and other ground feeders. But red milo, wheat, and cracked corn, leaned on heavily, are exactly the parts the classic feeder crowd skips. You paid for 20 pounds. They were only ever interested in maybe 12. Watch a single chickadee closely, and you'll see the rejection happen in real time. It lands. And it doesn't grab the first thing under its feet. It cocks its head, picks, drops, picks again, and finally leaves, with one black sunflower seed clamped in its bill, off to a branch to hammer it open and come straight back for another. That flicking motion, the one that sprays seed everywhere, isn't carelessness. It's selection. Birds have clear, measurable seed preferences, and researchers who have tested those preferences keep finding the same pattern. Given a choice, most feeder species reach for the high-fat seeds and shove the rest aside. So the mess you sweep up under the pole isn't your birds being greedy or wasteful. It's a verdict. Every flicked-away grain is a small, honest review of the food you set out, and they're leaving it for you in a pile you can actually see. Now follow that rejected pile through a few wet days, because this is where harmless stops being true. The discarded grain and the empty hulls sit on the ground. They get rained on, and they begin to break down. Damp, spoiling seed grows mold, and some of those molds are bad news for birds. There's a lung infection called aspergillosis that birds can pick up from moldy seed and moldy debris, and a soggy heap of uneaten filler under a feeder is just the kind of place it festers. So the cheap bag doesn't only waste your money, it builds a wet layer of food nobody wanted, right where ground feeders like juncos, doves, and white-throated sparrows come down to forage. The harm here isn't dramatic and it isn't instant. There's no single moment you'd catch. It's slow, and it's the part almost nobody connects back to the bag they carried in from the car. Here's a question worth asking before you top off the feeder again. Who else is coming to dinner? A steady supply of grain on the ground is an open invitation, and not only to birds. Rats and mice find spilled seed quickly, and once they've located a reliable food source, they tend to settle in and stay. Crowding brings its own trouble. When a lot of birds press in around a feeder in a contaminated ground pile, illness passes between them more easily. Outbreaks of salmonella, for instance, have moved through feeder flocks in some winters, hitting finches like pine siskins especially hard. None of this means feeding birds is risky. It isn't. And a clean setup is one of the kindest things you can offer them. It means the cheap filler mess quietly tips the odds the wrong way. More spoiled food, more crowding, more visitors you never invited, all from the bag that looked like the thrifty pick. Now the part I promised you. Hold a chickadee in your mind. It weighs about as much as 2 nickels. A body that small loses heat fast, and on a January night it has no full feeder, no furnace, nothing to lean on but what it managed to eat before the light went. To survive the cold, chickadees do something remarkable. They let their body temperature drop in a controlled, regulated way through the night to save energy, and they shiver in the dark to keep from freezing outright. Even with all of that, they can burn through a real share of their body weight by morning. They essentially wake up hungry and behind every single day of winter. That's why what you put out matters far more than the price on the bag suggests. A grain that's mostly bulk gives a tiny bird a poor return on a trip that costs genuine energy to make. A fat-rich seed gives it fuel that's worth the flight. You're not just filling a dish. You're stocking the pantry that a 2-nickel bird is quietly betting its life on, one freezing night after another. So what should be in the bag instead? Start with one seed, and you've already solved most of the problem. Black oil sunflower. Not the big striped kind you'd snack on at a ball game, the smaller, jet black one. The shell is thinner, so even small bills can crack it open, and the meat inside is high in fat, which is precisely the dense fuel those high metabolism birds are chasing. Chickadees, cardinals, finches, nuthatches, titmice, the whole familiar cast, will take black oil sunflower over nearly anything else you can offer them. If you've only ever bought mixes, switching to a single bag of straight black oil sunflower is the simplest upgrade there is. And if the shells on the ground bother you, you can buy it already hulled. Sunflower hearts or chips, so there's almost nothing left to sweep. Either way, you'll see the difference within a day. Less flicking, less waste, more birds settling in to eat instead of sorting and leaving. From there, 2 more additions cover the birds that sunflower alone doesn't fully satisfy. For goldfinches, house finches, and pine siskins, a feeder of Nyjer, those tiny, black thistle-like seeds is a magnet, as long as it's offered in a feeder built for its small size, so it doesn't simply pour out onto the ground. And in the cold months, good suet earns its keep, a block of rendered fat, often mixed with bits of seed, that hands woodpeckers, nuthatches, and chickadees concentrated energy at exactly the time of year they're burning through it fastest. Buy the quality suet that holds together in the cold, rather than the greasy kind that softens and turns rancid the moment there's a mild spell. 3 things: sunflower, Nyjer, suet, and you've covered almost every visitor your yard is likely to get. There's one more piece, and it's about the bag, not the bird. People assume the cheap mix is the frugal choice, but once you count what gets flicked to the ground and never eaten, you're often paying a bargain price for food that's half wasted. A bag of seed they actually finish can stretch further than a bag they pick through and abandon. And that brings us back to a small habit that ties everything together. Read the label. Turn the bag over, look at the first few ingredients, and if milo, wheat, and cracked corn are leading the list, you now know you're mostly buying weight. A few minutes ago, you might have walked right past that. From here on, you'll catch it every time you stand in the aisle. So go back to that kitchen window. Picture the pale ring of untouched grain under the pole, the pile you used to read as messy, ungrateful birds. You know now it was never that. It was a quiet review, left out in plain sight, of food that didn't fit the birds it was meant for. Change what's in the feeder and that ring begins to disappear, replaced by the empty hulls of seed that was worth landing for. The yard gets cleaner. The birds get the fuel a small, warm body needs to reach spring. And the thing you've been calling a chore, keeping the feeder full, turns back into what it quietly was the whole time. A steady hand on the pantry of creatures who are counting on you. I'd love to hear your version of this. Have you ever switched seed and watched the birds change their minds about your yard? Tell me what showed up and what finally stayed. Keep the window open, keep the dish honest, and I'll meet you back out here next time.